All right, this is the last module for the chapter that we are on, which is chapter 6. I have to go back and look and see what chapter I was on. I feel like we've been on this chapter for a while. But this is module 19, and it is the cognitive approaches to learning. So there is classical conditioning, there is operant conditioning, and there is kind of cognitive conditioning, I guess you could call it, but we call it cognitive learning. And the question that we want to answer in this chapter, or in this module, is what are the roles of cognition and thought in learning? So we talked so far about, with classical conditioning, how it was the connection between the unconditioned and the conditioned stimulus leading to the conditioned response. And operant conditioning, we discussed how it was how we are voluntarily acting on a stimulus in order to get a response. In this one, we want to take into account, our cognitions and our thoughts and how those play a role in actual learning. So that's what we're going to talk about in this last module. I want to start out talking about cognitive learning theory. So specifically, what we mean by cognitive learning theory is that it is an approach to the study of learning that focuses on our thought process, on the thought processes that underlie learning. Something that we have not thought about so far is the thought processes that occur when we are learning some new task or when we are learning about an association. In its most basic formulation, the cognitive learning theory suggests that it's not enough to say that people respond because of this assumed link between a stimulus and a response. So it's not just enough to say there's some stimulus and a response. You have to think about what thought processes occur between that stimulus and response. So instead of just saying there is this assumed link between the stimulus and response, instead, it is the idea that people develop this expectation that they will receive a reinforcer after making a response. That expectation is the thought process. You are expecting something to occur when you do this. You're expecting something to occur if you do that, so on and so forth. But there is this thought process that occurs between the two. One of these thought processes is what is called latent learning. Now, if you think about the word latent, you think about the word late. And that's exactly what we're talking about, late learning. With latent, I want to call it late learning. With latent learning, it is a learning in which a new behavior is not demonstrated until there is some sort of incentive that is given for displaying it. So you may have actually learned something, but you're not going to demonstrate that you learned it until you get reinforced for doing so. So latent learning occurs without reinforcement. You're learning how to do something, but you're not yet reinforced for it. And so you're not going to let on that you learned it until you do get reinforced for it. I think this will make more sense in just a minute when I talk about one of the research studies that occurred showing latent learning. So in the experiments that we do with rats, looking at latent learning, the rat seems to have developed a cognitive map. So it's this mental representation of spatial locations and directions. When we think about a cognitive map, when we're using animal research, we think about maze learning, okay? So in figure 1, this is actually shown on page 193 in your textbook. This is what we're talking about with this cognitive map. So you can see in letter A, here is this very intricate maze, right? Here's the start, and here is the finish with food. You can see that there's a curtain some places, and a one-way door with others. So they may go through, but they can't go back. Okay? So there's a curtain and there's a one-way door. So it shows latent learning. In letter A, this maze, the rats were allowed to roam through a maze of this sort once a day for 17 days. Okay? They were not reinforced. They were just allowed to roam through this maze for 17 days. The rats were never rewarded consistently. And the rats that were never rewarded, I said that wrong. The rats that were never rewarded consistently made the most errors, whereas those that received food at the finish every day consistently made far fewer errors. The results also showed latent learning. Rats that were rewarded only after the 10th day showed an immediate reduction in errors and soon became similar in error rate to the rats that had been rewarded consistently. So you had some rats that were never rewarded for those 17 days. You have some rats that were rewarded every day for 17 days. And you have some rats that were only rewarded after 10 days. The rats that were consistently rewarded, right, that's the experimental group, they had, or the reinforced control and the under rewarded. So the reinforced control, they got rewarded every single day. The experimental group got rewarded after 10 days. So you can see here on the 10th day, and then they made far fewer errors. The unrewarded control group never got rewarded, and they made the most errors. So you can see with this group that was only reinforced after 10 days. They still were put in this maze every single day for 10 days, but they weren't reinforced. But they were learning about the maze and just exploring it. Then on day 10, they were reinforced. So now on day 11 and day 12, you can see that they went right to the finish line, right? Right to the finish box where they got food because they had learned previously all the different curtains and all the different one-way doors that they get through in order to get reinforced. So there was some learning that occurred even though there was no reinforcement. Although you didn't see what they learned until they did get reinforced. I hope that makes sense. That may have been a little confusing the way that I explained it, but I hope once you go back and you relook at it again, it'll make a little bit more sense for you. Okay, so that's latent learning. We also have another type of cognitive learning, which is called observational learning. And observational learning is when you learn through imitation. You see what someone else does and you do the same thing. Now, Albert Bandura was one of the leading researchers whenever it comes to observational learning. He had what he called a Bobo doll experiment. So in his study, he used a blow-up doll. It's one of those dolls, I don't know if they still exist today, but it is a doll where if you punch it, it falls over and then it comes back up again. He called it a Bobo doll. Well, in this experiment, what happened is he had someone come in and it was usually a younger child come in and they were with the Bobo doll. And then what they did is this younger child watched a video of another person hitting the Bobo doll. And then the next day, when the child came in with the Bobo doll, the child would then hit the Bobo doll. So they observed an adult hitting the Bobo doll, and then they themselves also hit the Bobo doll. This is this classic Bobo doll experiment looking at observational learning. So it is particularly important where the operant conditioning technique, a trial and error approach, is inappropriate. Observational learning is viewed as a social phenomenon. It's often referred to as the social cognitive approach to learning. And some researchers believe that observational learning may have some sort of genetic basis to it, that some individuals are more inclined to observational learning or imitation behavior than other individuals. And we know this because of this really cool area, and I think I mentioned this back in chapter 3, mirror neurons, right? I think if you remember back where I was talking about how if I see you smile, and then I smile, but I may not even be aware that I'm smiling, right? That is how mirror neurons work. Well, whenever it comes to observational learning, mirror neurons fire when someone observes another person carrying out a behavior. So they themselves may not be carrying out that behavior, but their neurons are firing when they see someone else carrying out the behavior. And so again, you can see this as a type of observational learning. I want to talk in the next 2 slides about violence in TV and video games and whether or not that makes individuals more violent. So violence in television and video games, does the media's messages matter? Most psychologists in social psychology, that's usually where this researchers do this type of research, most psychologists agree that consuming high levels of media violence makes people more susceptible to acting violent or aggressive themselves. However, there is some contradictory research that exists showing that watching violent videos and playing violent video games does not make you more violent. I know there is one specific study I looked at, and it really depended on the age of the participant in this study, whether or not watching violent videos or playing violent video games led to more violent or aggressive behavior. So it says some contrary research findings do exist. For example, some researchers argue that violent video games may produce certain positive results, such as a rise in social networking, meaning that this is a way for these individuals to be social with other individuals, maybe through the playing of violent video games. The American Pediatric Association, however, has urged parents to minimize their children's exposure to violent media of any sort. So again, I think it really depends on the age of the individual. There is more research showing the damaging effects of watching violent video or playing violent video games than there is research showing that there are not harmful effects. So several aspects of media violence may contribute to real-life aggressive behavior. Several aspects of media violence may contribute to real-life aggressive behavior. Lowering the inhibitions against behaving aggressively. So normally we would have these inhibitions in place that we would not act on. However, if we are playing a violent video game or watching a violent video, our inhibitions are lowered. And so it's almost as though we are not inhibited in acting that out. This then can predispose us to view even non-aggressive acts as aggressive. So it also kind of desensitizes us to aggressive behavior. If you're used to seeing it all the time in these violent videos that you watch or in these violent videos that you play, it makes you desensitized to the violence that is occurring. It's almost like that habituation where you get to see it so often that you become desensitized to it. Real life exposure to actual violence also leads to an increase in aggression, right? So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind, that it's not only, we're talking about watching violent videos or playing violent video games makes you more aggressive, but also living in a very violent or aggressive environment would make you more aggressive and violent also. All right, what I want to end this module 19 on, and on this chapter overall, is the cultural influences that are there for learning. Some psychologists suggest that people develop particular learning styles, characteristic ways of approaching material based on their cultural background. So some believe that people have, based on their culture, that depends on ways that they're going to learn different learning styles and approach various material. Learning styles differ on several dimensions. So for example, people with a rational learning style master material best through understanding the big picture about something, more so than the micro part of it. Those with an analytical learning style do best when they first analyze the components. So these are two different learning styles, right? The rational learning style is, I just want to see the big picture, and that's the best way that I'm going to learn it. However, those on the opposite end who have the analytical learning style, they want to see all the basic components, and that's going to help them learn the best. So you can see that depends on what culture you live in or what culture you're accustomed to can have an effect on your learning and how well you are able to learn in different situations.